Alright, so we now have our drawers all glued up and are ready to start moving on to actually fitting them. Now, in most cases in these drawers, from what I've already checked so far and just done some light fitting to try and see if we're in the ballpark, most of the drawers are dialed in almost perfectly. They fit just between the drawer slides with enough room for any slack in the drawer slides to make up for any variance in there. And so I've gone through and installed some of the more complicated drawers already just to kind of wrap my head around it, but I'll show you guys some footage of that later on. And so the process of fitting these drawers in between those drawer slides starts with the hand plane and some sanders and that. So what we need to do now is clean up our joinery. So when I was cutting those dovetails, I made sure I left a little bit protruding. I intentionally left a 32nd of an inch on each corner of material protruding past. Now this is generally recommended by most people that use dovetails, just purely because it's better to have your dovetails proud intentionally and then go back in with a hand plane or something to clean them up, rather than screwing up and having your dovetails be inset. You don't ever want your joint to accidentally not line up. So if you add a little bit of extra material, it's just going to cover for any mistakes that you may make. And so cleaning these up is fairly simple. I've got a 40-degree blade in my low angle jack, and all I'm going to do is just knock off that end grain until it's completely flush with the rest of the surface here. And so I want to be very careful when I'm using the hand plane for this, because these drawers are looking really nicely. They're all sanded up to 220 grit, and all they need is a final hand sanding at around 180 grit. And so if I go too hard with the hand plane and cause a ton of tear in here, it's not going to look very good. I have done that on a couple of the drawers already, and I'm not super proud of it, but it's all stuff that comes with kind of the learning curve of doing this. And so in most of those cases, the tear out that I caused, anywhere where it was not hidden by the drawer slide, I made sure to clean it up. But anywhere where the drawer slide just covers it completely and hides it, I didn't worry about it too much. Because the nice thing is, when dealing with a drawer box and drawer slide construction like we are here, most of the surface doesn't matter if it's flat or square or any of that kind of stuff anymore. You just have to make sure that the front is flat and square, and then that is pretty much it, and the area around the drawer slides needs to be square. Then the next step is on the inside of the drawer. We do have a little bit of squeeze out. So just in the corners here, there's just areas where a little bit of glue made it in and squeezed out into the inner area. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to use a chisel, cut that out nice and cleanly, and it'll leave pretty much a perfect surface in there. Then the next step will be running around all of our exposed edges with a chamfer bit in the router. Now, the reason I do this is purely because when you're reaching into a drawer, you don't want to accidentally brush your hand on the back of the drawer there and cut your hand open. Or these corners are extremely sharp, and because this is hard maple, it'll hold that sharpness for a long time. If you slide your hand across that surface, you're going to cut your hand open. I've done it already a few times in the shop just working on this project. If you slide your hand across a piece of really well milled up lumber, it has an extremely sharp edge and can do a lot of damage. Then the final step will just be doing kind of a finish sanding. So on all the outside surfaces, I can just use my random orbital sander with a 180 grit pad to very quickly clean those up. Then on the inside, I can just use some sandpaper and hand sand it, purely because I'm trying to run an orbital sander through the inside of these drawers. It's just going to be kind of a nightmare. And so for cleaning up the end grain, you can see that I've got the board supported on my shooting board here. So I just have my shooting board, which is 2 pieces of 3/4 inch MDF. I've got it overhanging a little bit. It's held and supported on my bench. I've got a planing stop on this side to create some support, and then I've got a couple F-clamps right off camera there, just holding everything firmly in place so that this thing is firmly attached to my bench. And so what this allows me to do is I can put a lot of pressure on this piece here. Because we have that planing stop on the edge there, I can really put a lot of pressure to knock off that end grain nice and quickly. Then all I have to do is flip the drawer around and just knock off the other side, and it's a pretty quick process. All right, so now we can actually install our drawer into the dresser here. So we've got all the drawer sides pre-installed. You guys have already seen me do that. And so I've gone through on this tall dresser and I've installed all of the top 4 drawers here and then one of the bottom wide drawers, just so I kind of had a good idea of what I was talking about before I started showing it to you guys. So one of the big things I've learned here is where to place your screws. So in the instructions that come with the drawer slides, they tell you to place your screws in this first vertical slot here, in the middle just standard hole, and then in the back horizontal slot. Now what I found is with these four here, and it's especially important with these four here, is that you actually want to place all of your screws in only the horizontal slots. Because what that'll allow for is you to adjust the depth of that drawer. And so like I said, that's extremely important up here. So even though all these drawers have the exact same inset of the drawer slide, everything is referenced the exact same, all these drawers should be the exact same size, we have a pretty good variance along the front faces here, which is going to make it very hard to go through and align all of our face frames to these pieces here. In fact, between these drawers here, we have probably close to 1/8 of an inch difference there. So I don't know where that 1/8 of an inch came from. I don't know what measurement went wrong, what is going on here. From what I can tell, everything is basically perfectly aligned. So on all four of these drawers, I'm going to have to go back in, fill the old holes, and then I'm going to re-drill all of the holes and make sure that they're in the horizontal slots on the drawer slide section. That way I can adjust that slide back and forth however far I need. And so the way you want to go about doing this is you want to start by finding some kind of spacer material. So I have these little pieces of plywood. They're about 3/16 of an inch thick. Now when I was planning out these drawers, I was planning for 1/4 inch thick, but I can't find anything in my shop that would be exactly 1/4 of an inch thick, and I really didn't feel like milling anything, so this plywood that's a little over 3/16 of an inch thick works just fine. And so all I'm doing with that is I'm just setting it on the frame here, and that's what the drawer is going to sit on. And so that way when I actually put the drawer into the opening here, I know that that drawer is not sitting on that bottom frame, because if it's rubbing on that bottom frame constantly, it's going to jam up on the drawer slides, and there's no room for expansion and contraction of that wood. So now that I know that my drawer fits between the drawer slides here, and you can see that this one is a little bit on the looser side, so it has a little bit of movement to it, but it's got just enough movement to it that I can still mount the drawer slides to it. The four that are up here, they were pretty tight to fit in. They were pretty much a precise fit, and on a couple of them, I actually had to remove a little bit of material to actually make them fit in there. So that's more so what you want to go for, but this is also just fine. And so what you want to start by doing is just pulling out the drawer box by a little bit. And it's really important to make sure that your spacers are pulled all the way to the front, so you're always referencing against them. Because you want to make sure that when you're putting screws into this front portion here, that it's always going to be 3/16 of an inch from that bottom, from that shelf in the middle there. From there, it's pretty easy. So all you want to do is just pull out your drawer slide extension here and pull it pretty far out. And then I'm using a combination square here that's set to 1/8 of an inch depth. And all I'm going to do is pull my drawer tight up against there and just push this down, and so that I know that the front edge of this is exactly 1/8 of an inch in from the front face of our drawer here. And so when I was installing my drawer sides, I made sure that there was a 3/4 inch for my drawer front, and then I stepped them back 1/8 of an inch from that drawer front, just to cover up any issues that I may have. So we have a small gap in there that will just make it a little bit easier to install the drawer fronts. If we were trying to flush these up perfectly with the front face here, again, that could lead to problems later on when we're installing that drawer front, because there may be a little bump here, it may not go in perfectly. And so then with one screw in place for alignment, you know that your drawer slide is now mounted the right height from the bottom of your drawer. And so all I'm going to do is just take my square and align it to the edge of the drawer slide. And I'm just going to make sure that this drawer slide is completely square to the front face of my drawer. Now the trick here is that you need to try and keep everything fairly aligned. So when you're cleaning up your dovetails, you want to be very careful not to skew the front of your drawer, the angle or anything like that. You want to only take off the dovetails. You don't want to go biting into the front face of the material. You want to try and keep everything as square as possible so that when you're lining things up here, everything comes out square. Now I can go through, pre-drill my other holes, and get this thing put in place permanently. Okay, so we're gonna backtrack a little bit from fitting up the drawers because I want to go back and fix an issue that I caused earlier. So I showed you guys already that I fit the top 4 drawers on the tall dresser and that I wasn't really super impressed with how they were sitting because 2 of them were a little bit further forward than the other 2. So when we try to install our inset drawer fronts, they're gonna end up all bumpy in that, and there really wasn't a good way to adjust them the way that I had them set up. And so on all my drawers, I have 3 small screw holes that I'm just gonna fill with some plugs. Now you might be wondering why I'm going through the effort of filling them and why I'm using plugs. And so on your drawer sides, if you just accept the fact that, they're going to be hidden behind the drawer slide anyway, whatever, it doesn't matter, and you don't go back and fill them, you're just leaving a very big weakness in your drawer side. Over time, it's very likely that you'll get a crack over that space because you just have unsupported grain fibers in there. And so with that, the reason I'm using plugs here is there's not really any specific reason for it. You could use plugs, you could use dowels, you could cut a square hole and just put a piece of wood in there. You can really do whatever you want. The only reason that I'm using plugs is just because it's the easiest and fastest form to fill these. Dowels might be a little bit better. They might be a little bit of a stronger connection, but overall it's not really that. You're not really going for a strong connection. You just need material in that hole to fill it. So all I'm using is a 5/16 twist bit, and to just enlarge the hole slightly, then I'm pounding in a 5/16 plug. And so moving on to the wide dresser now, you can see that I've already got 2 drawers installed. They're both fitted in all nicely. They're both looking real good. But there is something that's different about these compared to all the other drawers that I've installed so far, and that is that these are a little bit oversized, which is the right way to do this. So basically all the other drawers that I've done have fit, just after cleaning up the dovetails. And so what I'm finding on these drawers is that I need to actually spend some time thinning down the sidewalls with my hand plane. Now, I'm not removing a ton of material. I'm only, maybe a 64th from each side. Just a little bit of material. It really doesn't take any time at all. But there is a few things that you have to be concerned about when you're doing this. Mainly that you're not breaking out the front edge or the back edge because you still want things to look pretty good here. You don't have a whole lot of material to work with, so you want to be very careful with how much you remove. It's also important to make sure you're moving material from both sides because if I take it all from one side, our screws are going to end up punching right through and you're going to be able to see them on the inside, which is not a good thing. So by taking about a 64th of an inch off both sides, I can get these drawers fitted in perfectly. Okay, so one thing I want to mention about this process about cleaning up the protruding dovetails here is that if you're using a low angle jack for this, you want to make sure you're using a 25-degree blade. Now, when I started this process, I wasn't. I was using a freshly sharpened 40-degree blade, and I was still having a lot of trouble cleaning up this end grain nicely and quickly. It was taking a very long time to do it. So in case you guys aren't aware, I've talked about this in a lot of my other videos, the blade angle on your low angle jack is going to make a massive difference to how it cuts. So basically the higher the blade angle, so if you go up to a 50-degree blade, that blade is going to do a lot better on your curlier grain, where you have a lot of grain changes, because it's more like a scraping action, like a card scraper. So it's going to do a little bit better on tear out. Now, it's not a great solution either way. Even when it's razor sharp, if you have really curly grain like you get in a lot of maple, you're still going to get some tear out here and there, from my experience anyway. Now, the downside is that 50-degree blade requires a lot of effort to push through the wood because you're cutting at a much different angle that's not really an ideal cutting angle per se, but is more ideal to prevent tear out. So if you go all the way down to a 25-degree blade, 25-degree blades are kind of your ideal cutting angle, but they do tend to cause a lot of tear out when you start going against the grain. But the trick is that 25 degrees is also the ideal angle for cutting your end grain. So when you're doing a lot of end grain cleanup, if you're using a 40 or 50 degree blade, not only is it going to be harder to push through the grain there, it's not going to cut as well for some reason. So the blade that I have in here now, I think I sharpened it when I started this process, when I decided to switch over to the 25 degree blade. And so far I've done, I think, 6 drawers with this blade without sharpening it. Basically, right now, what I'm getting and when I'm cleaning up this end grain is I'm getting these full shavings. So they kind of crumble apart in your hands. So to be able to get a clean end grain shaving like that is something that is very challenging to do. And you can only get it with a sharp blade or a properly angled blade. So when I was cutting with the 40-degree blade, I was not getting good clean shavings like that. They were kind of breaking off. I was breaking off a lot of the end grain pieces here and just was leaving kind of a mess. But with a 25-degree blade, that isn't even a razor sharp blade. You know, I've been using it across a few drawers here. It's doing an amazing job on all the end grain now, and it's a lot easier. Alright, so we're getting ready to reinstall that last drawer on the top here, and I just wanted to walk you guys through what I'm doing differently this time compared to what I did the first time. So there was the two big problems the last time was that I didn't have the proper spacing between my drawers, and my drawer fronts, or the front of the drawer boxes, were all misaligned in that. What I learned to do on the rest of my drawers is before I actually put the last two screws in the side pieces, I go through and just double check that I have my depth set right. So what I'm assuming, I took all the slides off and did all that and patched these before I even thought of doing that. But now on these bottom three that I've done so far, when I go through and I make sure that I align that slide back the right depth, they're all coming out just perfect. Same with all the ones on the top of the wide dresser over there. The other difference is I'm using properly sized spacers. And so on the bottom, I use these two properly sized, exactly 1/4 inch spacers, which you probably saw me start using on all the other drawers there. So that was the bottom. Then for the middle, rather than trying to make more 1/4 inch spacers and stacking them on top of each other, I decided to just make two simple 1/2 inch spacers. Now these are again exactly a 1/2 inch. I use my calipers, dialed that in, so now I know there's going to be exactly a 1/2 inch between each of my drawers, which is what I measured for. So now after doing all that, I can see that I've got the right spacing on my top drawer here. We're a little bit lower than I would have liked. I obviously just didn't do my math as accurate as I probably should have. But the problem I would have had before is that my drawer fronts would have overlapped with the drawer below them. There wasn't enough spacing between the drawers to create enough clearance. But now that I know there's exactly a 1/2 inch between these drawers, there's going to be plenty of space for those drawer fronts to be mounted on. Alright, so we are on to the last drawer of this entire project, which is pretty exciting, except for the fact that this is our short drawer. So if you guys remember when we were milling the stock, I mentioned that one of my front pieces was just way too short. I cut the material from the raw piece of wood. I cut it way too short. I don't know why I did that, but it was a bad mistake on my part. So what I ended up doing is I just cut it to whatever maximum length I could get out of it. Then I also cut a back piece to match, so that way I could make a full drawer that I knew was going to come out a little bit short. Now, if I had a better budget for this project and I had more wood lying around, I probably would have just gone through and remade that one piece, because that would have made more sense. But because doing that would have required going to the lumber yard again just for a single piece of wood to turn into a thin little piece like this, it just wasn't worthwhile. So instead, we're just going to do a little repair and shim out this drawer when we mount it in the drawer slides here. And so with the drawer installed, you can see that there is a pretty good amount of lateral movement. When I measured it with my setup blocks, it's about 5/32 of an inch that we have extra space in there. So over on the table saw, I already cut down these two strips. They're a little bit wonky. They're kind of just leftovers from the offcuts that we had when we were milling a bunch of the drawer pieces. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to thin these down to about 5/64 of an inch and attach them to both sides. Now the reason I can do this is purely because I have a drum sander, and my drum sander's minimum thickness that it can work with is about 1/32 of an inch. Now obviously if you don't have a drum sander, you can't really deal with that thin of material. Most planers max out at going 1/8 of an inch thick. So if you only have a planer and you still want to shim on both sides, you can use the planer to get it close down to that about 1/8 of an inch thick. Then you can just use a hand plane to thin them down the rest of the way. Now I don't really want to do that. I have a drum sander, it makes my life easier. Alright, so there's our finished mounted drawer, and you can see that that is a fairly good fix to that solution. Again, it's not perfect. I will say one thing that I did differently on each side. On this side, I tried to mix CA glue and just normal wood glue, and that did not work. That actually made the piece of wood, this little thin piece of wood, start to cup away and pull away as that glue started to, as it absorbed the moisture from the glue. So I don't recommend doing that. On the other side, I only used CA glue. Or super glue, and that worked perfectly. It stayed perfectly flat, held in, and was much quicker. It took no time to dry. So yeah, this side, I'm going to try and get back in there with a little bit of glue right in the corner here, because it's really only noticeable on the front here. But once we put the drawer front on this, you're never going to see it anyway, so it really doesn't matter that much. It's just personal annoyance here. So what you could do to blend these in a little bit better is once they're actually attached here, you could go through and round over the edges with some sandpaper, even taking your random orbital sander and just going over the edge there. All of that would just knock it down. The other thing that I want to mention is I said that before that you could only use the drum sander to get these thin pieces, but that is clearly wrong. But all you really need to do to get thin shims like this, if you don't have a drum sander, is just glue 2 1/8-inch thick pieces to the side here, and then just use a hand plane to sneak up on the fit, just like we did on the rest of the drawers. So that would be a perfectly viable option and would give you the same look as I've got here. But we've got our fix in place. It looks pretty good. It's not going to be anything that anyone is going to notice.